The year was 1943. Across Europe, entire cities lay in rubble, and yet, in the quiet fields of America, the war had taken on a strange, almost gentle rhythm. The wheat swayed, trains hummed, and beyond the plains of Texas, fences of barbed wire gleamed under the noon sun. Behind those fences were men once feared, and women once proud, now prisoners of a war that had taken everything from them except the memory of their arrogance. They arrived in groups, widows of German officers, nurses from broken hospitals, assistants who had seen the Reich rise and fall in flames. The United States had agreed to host them under the Geneva Convention, a gesture of decency the Germans hadn't expected. The locals, too, were curious. In towns like Hearne and Mexia, Texas, or Aliceville, Alabama, the sudden appearance of German POW camps turned sleepy southern landscapes into symbols of global consequence. Children would ride their bicycles near the fences, whispering, "Nazis," half afraid, half fascinated. Among the new arrivals was Elise Muller, 31 years old. Her husband, Otto, had died in North Africa 2 years earlier, a casualty of Rommel's failed campaign. She wore black always. Her eyes were gray, the kind that didn't soften even when she smiled. Elise had once been a nurse in Leipzig, then conscripted to assist in the logistics unit that now found itself volunteered to America. To her, the camp wasn't just a prison. It was humiliation wrapped in sunlight. She and the other widows had been raised on stories of the German soldier, impeccable, brave, carved from iron. To see their conquerors now, these Americans with rolled sleeves and easy laughter, felt like mockery. "They call these men soldiers?" Elise would whisper in German, loud enough for the guards to hear. "They don't even march. They stroll." The other women chuckled, their bitterness disguised as humor. They spoke of the American slang, their casual posture, their broad grins. To them, discipline had died somewhere between jazz and chewing gum. But the Americans didn't react. They simply worked. They hauled lumber, served rations, and handed out coffee with a calm that unsettled the Europeans. Captain Daniel Reed, a camp officer from Kansas, oversaw their arrival. He wasn't what Elise imagined when she thought of an enemy officer. No medals, no sharp salutes, no shouting. He greeted them with the unhurried politeness of a man raised among open skies. "You'll find it peaceful here," he said through a translator. "The rules are simple. No escape, no harm, no hunger." It was strange hearing those words from the supposed victor. Elise looked at him, then away, muttering under her breath, "Peaceful captivity is still captivity." Days bled into weeks. The widows were assigned tasks: laundry, sewing, light fieldwork. They watched American soldiers move like quiet machines, all muscle and sweat, their shirts soaked in the southern heat. There was something unnerving about their strength. It wasn't performed. It wasn't loud. It was lived. One morning, Elise watched a corporal lift a crate she knew 2 German men would have struggled with. His face didn't change, his breath didn't quicken. He just did it like it meant nothing. The women turned away, uneasy. Pride, when confronted with quiet power, often looks for distraction. At night, in the barracks, the widows whispered memories of home. The smell of rye bread, the echo of church bells, the cold mornings when the world still made sense. Outside, the guards played harmonicas, the notes drifting through the wire like ghosts of a gentler world. Elise lay awake listening, half hating the melody for how beautiful it sounded. "They play music," she said softly, "as if this is not war at all." Another widow replied, "They have no war on their soil. That's why they can afford music." The narrator's voice might lower here, steady, reflective. War had drawn borders across the map, but none so sharp as the line between dignity and defeat. For many of these women, America was not an enemy. It was a mirror, showing them what remained when the illusion of superiority was gone. In the mess hall, the contrasts deepened. American guards ate cornbread, beans, and thick slices of meat, while the German women, though not starved, were served simpler rations. Elise noticed how the soldiers bowed their heads before eating. It was a small gesture, but one that puzzled her. They prayed. Germans, too, prayed, but theirs had become a prayer for victory, not mercy. The Americans prayed for gratitude. That difference lingered in her mind longer than she cared to admit. Letters from home arrived sporadically. Most brought bad news: cities bombed, families scattered. Elisa's letter came on a damp October morning. Her mother had died in an air raid. Her home was gone. She read it in silence, folding the paper with surgical precision, as if controlling its edges could control her grief. Captain Reed noticed her shaking hands but said nothing. Later that day, she saw him place a small bag of sugar on her table. No words, no gesture, just sugar, precious in wartime. She stared at it, confused. Pity, she thought, or kindness. In war, sometimes they look the same. The widow's mockery began to sound weaker. They still talked, but the laughter didn't last long. The American guards seemed unaffected by insult, as if immune to hatred. They shared newspapers, let the prisoners hear radio music, even allowed them to grow flowers near the barracks. Elise found herself tending to a small patch of soil near the fence. She didn't know why. Maybe it reminded her of Leipzig before the sirens. Maybe it was something to keep her hands from trembling. The narrator would pause here, allowing the image to settle. A widow in a foreign land, planting seeds where the war had buried her past. Then came the day that would unsettle every assumption they held. A new transport arrived, American reinforcements assigned to assist camp security. As the trucks rolled in, the dust rose like storm clouds. The German women gathered near the fence, curious. What stepped down from those trucks silenced even the boldest tongue. These were not the smiling, easygoing men they'd mocked. They were giants, farm-bred soldiers, tall, broad-shouldered, their faces lined by sun and labor. Their movements were calm but carried a weight that seemed carved from the very earth. Elisa's breath caught. One of them turned, his silhouette cutting against the horizon. He wasn't handsome in a polished way, but there was something arresting, raw, grounded, elemental. He carried 2 heavy crates, one in each hand, as if they weighed nothing. A ripple of murmurs passed through the crowd. The widows stood straighter, suddenly aware of their smallness. No one laughed. Not this time. The narrator's voice would slow, deliberate. For the first time, the women who mocked the victors felt something unexpected. Not fear, not admiration, but humility. That night, Elise couldn't sleep. She thought of Otto, his iron will, his uniform pressed to perfection. She thought of these Americans. Mud on their boots, easy in their own skin, yet somehow more disciplined than any soldier she'd known. The idea unsettled her. Could strength exist without cruelty? Could victory be gentle? Outside, a storm brewed over the plains, thunder rolling like distant artillery. Elise stood by the window, rain streaking the glass. In the faint reflection, she saw herself. Tired eyes, clenched jaw, and behind her, the faint outline of a guard walking his patrol, calm and unbothered by the storm. She whispered, barely audible, "Maybe they are not what we were told." Lightning flashed, the sky momentarily white. The wind carried the sound of laughter from the guards' quarters. A deep, human laughter that didn't mock, didn't hate. For the first time since arriving, Elise didn't feel anger. She felt something harder to face. Curiosity. The camera of history would linger there, on her face, rain and reflection merging in one trembling frame. The voice would return, quiet but certain. In that moment, the walls of war didn't fall, they softened. And before the women knew it, their pride had already begun to crack. But what they didn't yet realize was that the men they mocked were about to show them what real strength looked like. The morning after the storm smelled of wet dust and pine resin. The camp was quiet, except for the rhythmic clang of the flagpole halyard tapping against metal. Mist hung low across the field, softening the wire fences into silver threads that disappeared into the haze. Beyond them, movement stirred. Trucks lined in formation, hoods glistening from last night's rain. The new detachment had arrived before dawn, and by the time the widows gathered near the barracks, the first rays of sunlight were already striking their uniforms like polished steel. Elise stood apart from the others, her shawl drawn close. Her eyes followed the Americans stepping down from the vehicles, boots sinking slightly in the wet soil. They were unlike the camp's usual guards. These men carried the weight of real battle. They moved with the same patience as those who had already seen too much, but their presence filled the air like thunder that hadn't yet struck. One man, towering above the rest, caught her attention. He lifted a water barrel with both hands, muscles tensing beneath a sweat-darkened shirt, and carried it without a word toward the kitchen tents. He didn't look around, didn't perform for the audience of German women watching from the distance. That absence of vanity made him impossible to mock. His name, the others would later learn, was Corporal Jack Turner. Born in Kansas, raised on fields of wheat and storms. 27 years old. He had fought in Italy and carried a scar across his forearm where shrapnel once tore through flesh. To Elise, he was the first American she could not dismiss with laughter. His silence held authority. His kindness, when it showed, carried weight. The widows still whispered among themselves, unable to admit their fascination. "They look like oxen," one woman said with forced confidence. "Built for labor, not thought." Another replied, quieter, "Perhaps that's what wins wars." Their eyes betrayed them. Their words no longer carried the sting of pride. Inside the camp, work resumed. The prisoners washed linens, chopped wood, hauled supplies. The Americans worked beside them, sharing tools and sweat but not conversation. The rules forbade casual exchange, but the rhythm of labor built its own language. Elise saw Turner again 2 days later when her group was assigned to help unload grain sacks. The sun had returned, bright and merciless. She struggled with the first bag, the coarse fabric cutting into her palms. Before she could adjust her grip, a shadow fell across her. Turner lifted the sack from her arms with effortless motion. She froze, expecting mockery. Instead, he nodded just once and placed the load neatly onto the pile. His voice was low, polite, but firm. "Don't strain yourself, ma'am." No translator was needed. Tone transcended language. Elise felt her chest tighten, not with gratitude, but with something harder to name. Humiliation. No, it wasn't that. It was the shock of decency in a place where she'd expected none. That evening, she lingered near the fence, watching him clean his rifle under the orange glow of dusk. He hummed softly, some American tune, steady and unhurried. Around him, the camp quieted. Men who could crush bone with a single strike now carved wood figures for local children, repaired roofs, wrote letters home. They were giants, but they carried their strength like a burden rather than a weapon. The narrator's tone would soften, turning inward. For Elise, every gesture began to rewrite what she had believed about enemies. She had been taught that strength came only from dominance, yet here it stood before her, quiet, unprovoked, patient. Days folded into one another. The German widow's laughter grew rare. They no longer mocked the way Americans walked or talked. Instead, they began to imitate the guards' steady gestures, folding sleeves the same way, humming their tunes under breath. It was an unconscious surrender of pride, and Elise felt it happening within her too, though she pretended not to notice. The Americans, for their part, treated the women not as prisoners but as responsibilities. They offered gloves when frost came, extra rations when supplies allowed. Turner once slipped a small tin of salve onto Elise's workbench after noticing the blisters on her palms. She found it later, unsaid and unexplained. That quiet compassion disturbed her more than cruelty ever could. It made her remember Otto, not the soldier, but the man who once brought her wildflowers from the Elbe. One afternoon, during a supply delivery, a jeep stalled near the gate. 2 Americans tried to push it out of the mud, cursing softly as the wheels spun uselessly. Elise stood nearby with other women, arms crossed, pretending indifference. Then Turner stepped forward. Without a word, he placed his shoulder against the bumper, veins tightening across his forearms. The engine roared, the jeep lurched free, and everyone around clapped or laughed lightly. Turner only smiled, brushing mud from his boots. His eyes met Elise's for a brief instant. No triumph, no teasing. Just acknowledgement. That quiet moment lasted longer in her mind than the whole day's labor. Later that night, rain began again. Inside the barracks, the widows listened to it drumming on tin roofs. Someone mentioned Turner's strength, someone else his silence. Elise said nothing, but in her mind she replayed the image of him standing in the rain, unshaken. For the first time, she wondered whether kindness required more courage than cruelty ever did. By mid-November, the camp routine had changed. The women spoke less of Germany and more of small things: weather, crops, the songs the guards played on their radios. When American mail arrived, laughter rippled through the camp. Photographs of children, wives, farms blanketed in snow. The widows leaned close to look, their guarded hearts briefly softened by the sight of ordinary life continuing somewhere beyond war. Elise stared longest at one photograph. A simple porch, a rocking chair, and a dog sleeping beside it. Peace looked strange to her, like something she had once known but forgotten how to hold. The narrator would deepen the tone here, reflective but firm. Power changes meaning when stripped of pride. To those who once worshipped conquest, mercy felt alien, almost unbearable. Elise began to walk the perimeter fence each morning before work. Sometimes she caught Turner on duty near the eastern watchtower. He always greeted her with the same subtle nod, the same restrained politeness. Once, as she passed, he said something in slow, careful German. "Schöner Morgen," beautiful morning. His accent was heavy, but the effort was unmistakable. Elise felt heat rise in her chest. She wanted to reply but couldn't. Words, once her weapon, had abandoned her. As weeks went by, their unspoken understanding grew in the spaces between orders and silence. He was a guard, she a prisoner, yet neither played their role as the world expected. To Elise, Turner represented everything her husband's war had tried to erase. Humanity unbroken by victory. The final days of autumn painted the camp gold. Leaves fell against the wire, and children from nearby farms sometimes wandered close to wave at the soldiers. The widows watched, their hearts quietly thawing. Even the barbed wire seemed less like a cage and more like a boundary between two exhausted nations resting from madness. Elise began to help voluntarily with the infirmary work, treating minor wounds, organizing medicines. Turner often assisted with lifting patients, his presence steady and reassuring. One afternoon, as they worked side by side, a soldier passed by whistling, "Silent Night." Elise froze. The melody struck a nerve. Turner glanced at her, then, very softly, began humming along. She turned toward him, surprised. For a fleeting instant, there were no sides, only two people sharing the same song under different flags. Outside, twilight settled over the camp like an old quilt, stitched from light and dust. The narrator's voice would linger, almost hushed. For months, they had seen each other across the fences of pride and grief. Now, for the first time, they were seeing what stood behind them. Men and women, not enemies. But before that fragile peace could take root, a new order arrived from headquarters. One that would test every illusion of safety the camp had built. The winter wind swept across the camp like a living thing, carrying with it the smell of pine, damp soil, and faint wood smoke from the American barracks. The days had grown shorter, and frost formed thin silver lines along the fence each dawn. The German widows worked with gloved hands and lowered heads, breath clouding in the cold. Elise moved among them silently, her motions practiced, precise. Something in her had quieted over the weeks. The sharpness that once lived in her voice had dulled to something slower, heavier. One morning, the sound of laughter drifted from the American kitchen. It was deep, relaxed, the kind of laughter that came from men who hadn't forgotten how to feel alive. Elise paused by the fence, drawn by the warmth of it. Through the open door, she saw Turner stirring a large pot, steam rising in slow, ghostly coils. The smell of roasted coffee drifted through the air, rich and unfamiliar. To the widows, it was a luxury, something from another world. Elise stood there longer than she meant to, watching. Turner looked up, noticed her, and without hesitation filled a tin cup. He walked toward the fence, the steam curling in the cold. He held it out. "Coffee," he said simply. Elise stared at it, uncertain. Not allowed, she murmured in German. He shrugged, the faintest smile on his lips. Then call it kindness. The fence between them hummed with a low wind, strands glinting like piano wires in the sun. Slowly, she reached through, her fingertips brushing the edge of the cup. It was warm, painfully so, but she didn't let go. She lifted it to her lips, tasting bitterness and comfort in the same breath. For a long time, neither spoke. The world beyond the wire had gone quiet. Later that day, whispers spread through the barracks. Some of the women were scandalized, others curious. He offered her coffee, one said, half in disbelief. She took it. Elise pretended not to hear, but that night, she dreamt of her husband's voice, stern and distant, asking why she'd let an American soften her resolve. When she woke, she found her palms still smelling faintly of roasted beans. The days rolled on, colder, slower. Snow began to fall in light drifts, a rare thing in that part of Texas. The guards helped cover the roofs with canvas, their laughter mingling with the sound of hammers and wind. Turner crossed paths with Elise often now, at the well, at the supply yard, near the infirmary tent. Their exchanges remained brief but human. Once, he handed her a pair of wool gloves left behind by another worker. You'll need them, he said. She took them without a word, her fingers brushing his. Something unspoken passed, a recognition neither of them dared name. The narrator's tone would slow here, almost tender. It was in the smallest gestures that the war began to lose its hold, one act of warmth replacing 1,000 cold ideologies. Each day, the widow's work continued, but something inside the camp was shifting. They began humming to themselves while sewing, laughing softly at the guards' jokes, sharing scraps of American chocolate traded for hand-mended shirts. Elise noticed it too. The bitterness that had defined their first months was dissolving, replaced by something both terrifying and freeing: compassion. But compassion is never easy for the proud. One afternoon, Elise was carrying a pail of water when she slipped on a patch of frozen mud. The pail spilled, soaking her skirt, and pain shot through her wrist as she fell. Before she could stand, Turner was there, hand outstretched. You all right? He asked. She pulled back instinctively. I don't need help, she muttered. He didn't argue. He knelt, picked up the pail, and refilled it from the well. Then take this, he said, handing it back. No harm in balance. His calm disarmed her anger. For the first time, she smiled, small, fragile, but real. That night, sitting by the weak glow of a kerosene lamp, Elise wrote a letter she knew would never be sent. To Otto, she began, I thought strength was the ability to stand alone. But I think now it may also be the ability to kneel beside someone else. She paused, her pen trembling. The page caught a tear before she could stop it. Weeks passed, and the camp took on a rhythm that felt almost like peace. The Americans shared newspapers and music. The prisoners offered songs from home in return. On Christmas Eve, the guards arranged a small gathering, part tradition, part defiance against the loneliness of war. They played carols on a harmonica, voices low, hesitant at first. Then, to everyone's surprise, one of the German widows joined in. Her voice was clear and haunting. Others followed. The language barrier melted into melody. Even Elise sang, her voice shaking when she reached the line about peace on earth. Turner stood near the fire, arms folded, watching her. The flames painted his face in shades of amber and shadow. When the song ended, he walked over, holding a cup of coffee again. This time, he didn't have to offer. She took it quietly, sipping as the snow fell around them. You miss home? He asked softly. She nodded. You? He smiled faintly. Every day. But some places remind you why it's worth fighting for it. His eyes lingered on her face for a heartbeat longer than they should have. Then he looked away, hands buried in his coat. The narrator's voice would come in low, almost like a thought. In that brief exchange, the war lost its borders. They were no longer enemy and prisoner. They were two souls adrift in the same cold season, trying to find warmth where the world had forgotten it. After that night, Something unspoken settled over the camp. The women worked with softer eyes. The soldiers, too, seemed gentler, slower to shout. Acts of quiet cooperation became normal. An exchanged word, a shared tool, a gesture of respect. Pride was dissolving, replaced by something older than nations, empathy. Yet beneath that calm, the conflict still simmered. Outside the fences, the war dragged on. Newspapers whispered of the Allies pushing deeper into Europe. Rumors said Germany was breaking apart. For Elise, every headline was both relief and guilt. Her husband had died for a cause now unraveling, and she was here, learning kindness from those he'd called weak. One morning, she approached Turner at the fence, her breath visible in the cold air. "When the war ends," she said quietly, "will you forget us?" He looked at her for a long moment before answering. "No, some things you don't forget. You just carry them differently." The words stayed with her long after he left. Carry them differently. Perhaps that was what survival meant. Not burying the past, but transforming it. The sun dipped low that evening, painting the horizon gold. Elise stood by the same fence where she'd first tasted his coffee months ago. She placed her gloved hand against the wire, feeling the faint vibration of wind through metal. Beyond it, Turner walked the perimeter, his silhouette framed by the dying light. He turned once, as if sensing her presence, and raised his hand slightly, a gesture between farewell and promise. The narrator's final line would linger in the quiet. In the heart of a war built on division, a single act of compassion had done what armies could not. It had conquered pride. But what neither of them knew was that the peace inside those fences was fragile. And soon, the outside world would come crashing through it. The final winter of the war came with a strange quiet, like the world itself was holding its breath. The camp seemed smaller now, as if the fences had drawn inward. Snow fell without sound, layering roofs and boots and barbed wire in the same indifferent white. Turner's patrols grew longer, slower. The telegrams had started arriving, one by one, telling the men the war in Europe was nearing its end. But inside the camp, for the widows, time moved differently. To them, peace was still a rumor. Elise had changed. The sharp angles of her pride had worn smooth. She no longer mocked or measured the guards. She simply watched. Each morning she brought hot water for the infirmary, tended to cuts and bruises, and worked beside the men without fear. The other widows followed her quiet example. It wasn't obedience. It was understanding. Somewhere in that frozen season, hatred had thawed. Then came the day the supply truck overturned near the gate. The air was bitter cold, and sleet stung like needles. Turner and a handful of men rushed to unload the crates before they froze in the mud. The widows were ordered to stay back, but Elise saw one of the men slip, a heavy crate pinning his leg. Without thinking, she ran forward. A shout rang out, "Stop! Back!" But she didn't hear it. She pushed her shoulder under the corner of the crate, her breath short, her palms burning. Turner saw her and dropped beside her, his hands gripping the opposite edge. "Together," he said. She nodded and they heaved. The wood shifted. The trapped soldier dragged himself clear. For a moment, everything was motion and breath and raw effort. Then it was done. They both fell back into the snow, gasping. The world was silent except for their breathing and the hiss of falling sleet. When Turner turned to her, his face was pale, lips blue from the cold. "You could have been hurt," he said. She smiled faintly. "So could you." Something in his expression softened, something almost fragile. Around them, the other widows had gathered, staring in disbelief. For years, they had been told Americans were monsters of propaganda, heartless occupiers. Yet here lay their captor and one of their own, side by side in the snow, saving a life together. The line between them had vanished. That night, the infirmary glowed with lamplight. The rescued soldier rested on a cot, his leg bound tight. Elise worked quietly, cleaning mud from Turner's sleeve where it had torn. He tried to protest, but she silenced him with a look. "You do the same," she said softly. He smiled. "Guess we're both stubborn." Outside, a radio crackled. A voice announced that Allied forces had crossed the Rhine. Cheers echoed faintly from the barracks, but neither Elise nor Turner moved. They were listening to something else, the silence between them, thick with what had gone unsaid for months. Finally, Turner spoke. "When this ends, you'll go home." She nodded slowly. "If there's still a home." He hesitated, then said, "If not, build one. You're stronger than most I've ever met." His words were simple, but to Elise, they carried the weight of a lifetime. She turned toward the window. Snow was still falling, soft and endless, covering the world in the same white. She thought of Otto, of all that had been lost, and for the first time, she didn't feel only sorrow. She felt gratitude for survival, for grace, for the strange mercy of strangers. Days later, an order came from Washington. The POWs would be processed for repatriation within the month. The news spread quickly, stirring mixed emotions. Some widows cried with relief, others with dread. Elise felt neither. She simply watched Turner as he read the notice aloud, his jaw tight. He didn't look at her when he finished, only folded the paper carefully, as if holding something delicate. Their final morning came too soon. The sun rose red over the camp, painting the frost in streaks of gold. The widows gathered near the transport trucks, clutching small bags, their lives reduced to canvas and string. Turner stood by the gate, hands clasped behind his back. When Elise reached him, she stopped. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he extended his hand, slow and uncertain. She took it, her fingers trembling inside his rough grasp. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." He met her eyes. "Don't thank me. You taught us more than we taught you." The sound of engines rumbled through the air. She wanted to say more, but the moment was already dissolving. He released her hand and stepped back. The truck doors closed one by one. As it began to roll away, Elise turned in her seat. Turner stood alone in the snow, the flag above him fluttering in the pale light. She raised her gloved hand once, a final salute. Not to a soldier, but to a man. The narrator's voice would settle here, low and resonant. History will remember battles and treaties, but rarely the fences where mercy was born. Behind those wires, a handful of enemies became human again. In the heart of war, compassion stood taller than any uniform, any weapon, any wall. As the trucks vanished into the horizon, the wind rose, carrying with it the faintest echo of laughter, the kind that once began with mockery but ended in understanding. The camera of time would fade on Turner's silhouette, unshaken, his breath rising like smoke into the morning cold. And for those who had lived through that winter, one truth would remain. Strength is not in the hand that conquers, but in the one that helps another stand.